Today we're going to take a look at layering trees to create depth. And I've got images here of course, trees, but they're jumbled up and the values are very close. Uh, and a lot of them, there's just as much detail in the background as there is in the foreground. And as painters, we want to take that and simplify the shapes as they recede. In other words, less detail. Also, the values, I want layers or sections of trees that gradually get lighter as they go back and cooler. And this one is not that bad. You do have the distant blue layer back in here that goes way back there. But the trees, as they come forward, you kind of lose depth in here. You can't really separate any distance in the middle ground, foreground on either side. So this flattens out. So we want to be able to separate to create some depth. And the main thing about separating is to simplify. It's not just to get things lighter as they recede. I want to really pull some groups of trees together to make a more simple shape. I might even have trees that create more layers and pull them together and make just one layer. If it gets really cluttered, the more you can simplify, the better. I'll typically look at it and I'll find the foreground trees first and mass them together. So all this in here, some background showing through here, but all that in the foreground. This is all foreground, and here be a little bit of two foregrounds there, two layers there in the foreground. And then separated back in here to maybe a layer here, another layer that's in front of that here, even another one in front of that there, but I might be getting too many. So if I simplify that a bit more and create a shape here that creates one layer. So I have 1, 2, 3 layers there, then 4, and then 5, and 6 or 7. That's quite a few layers. Usually you can simplify it a lot more than that. And I have some paintings here to look at first before we do that. They're all John Carlson, which John Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting. And when you look at this, you can see, the foreground layers of the large trunks in the foreground. Try and get it small enough. There we go. Now all this is foreground. And then the next layer back in here of these trees. And then you get the lighter and then the darker. But what you notice about all of them, and this layer right here continues on the other side over there. So I've got one layer, 2, 3, although 2 and 3 might be kind of on the same level, 4, and then 5. And what he's done, as you can see as it goes back, he really gets rid of detail. Very little detail back in here. There's some broken color, subtle color variations, a little bit of value variation, but not much compared to the foreground where there's a lot more lights and darks dabbled around. So he's taken of course, we don't know what he was looking at originally, but taken a fairly complicated subject of trees, cluttered, massed together, and he's simplified. One thing that really helps is the big mass of dark value against the big mass of light value. And then dark value again in the foreground. So he's playing those big shapes of dark and light off each other. They create large masses that create better compositions. If he were to break these lights up in here with too much detail, or these darks up in here with too many lights on top, he would lose the real nice contrast of the dark and light in there. So simpler you can keep, especially as things go back, simpler you can keep the values, the better. These trees are in shadow, some lights in them, but they remain dominantly in shadow. These trees are in sunlight. There's some darks in there, but they're predominantly in the light. The same thing back in here, predominantly in the dark, even though there's some lights. So that's what we're looking at is simplifying, separating shapes, and creating more masses. Now this is winter, and the other one might have been winter too. And you can really see the layers. These trunks here are the front layer, and maybe a background layer of some trunks, and then a layer back in here, and then the farthest layer becomes very muted, very cool, very grayed, so it stays back. Some detail in the background, but compared to the foreground, which is the big thing, is it's about comparison. The background is very, very simple, less detail compared to all this stuff in here. A lot of detail up front, or more detail. But that creates that layering. You can drop the detail, simplify the shapes, pull the trees together, force all the trees into 3 or 4 or 5 layers. Of course, the more depth you have, the more layers you're going to have. But if you can simplify those shapes, it's just going to read so much better. And get used to the idea that the goal is not to copy the photograph, even if you really like the photograph. My goal is always to simplify what I see a lot and be able to suggest the light with the very simple shapes. Now this one, 2, maybe 3 layers. He's got the foreground trunks in here as, you know, the front layer, then maybe a back layer of smaller trees. And then the background. The background just becomes a blue backdrop. Hardly any value change back in there at all. And that really allows the foreground trees to separate, really come forward. And he can get away with a lot more stuff in here. All that foliage, branches, because the background is so simple. If the background wasn't simple and it had just as many leaves, branches, everything would just blend together and become one flat plane. So the more we can separate, the better, and simplify as we go back. Also the colors, this is an extreme version, but the colors of course get muted and cooler. So I can have a yellow way in the distance, but it's a very muted grayed yellow compared to the yellow that's in front. Or yellow, green, or orange, or green, or whatever color we happen to be using. So that's what I want to do here. I want to pull these together and simplify them. And what I've done here on this, and again, as I'm massing these trees, this, get this a bit bigger, this tree right here, we look at the photograph of it, all you see this the dots of leaves. So it's very important to mass it together. Simple shape of dark and light. And that's what I've tried to do to everything in here. Everything becomes more of a simple dark and light. A bit more broken up in the foreground. There's more smaller darks and lights in the foreground trees. But then as I go back, they get more and more simple. Colors get a bit more muted. I have a little stronger yellow-orange here than back in here. It's a little more faded. Generally means I'm adding a little bit of violet to everything as it goes back. So whether it's a green tree, has no violet in front, these yellow-greens here. Back here, the yellow-green has some violet in it. It also has a bit of red or orange in it, but I can always count on just adding a little violet as it goes back. Make sure it's the right value. I don't want to add a dark violet to a real light color right in the distance. I have to make the violet the right value first. But everything as it goes back has less detail, a bit cooler or more violet, kind of the same thing. Instead of adding violet, I can also just add the complement to gray it. And that makes it recede. But again, you can see simplifying everything first, then making sure as things go back they're even more simple. Colors get grayer and also cooler. So photograph isn't too bad. without simplifying it, but by eliminating a lot of that clutter and detail, it makes it easier to see. And that's how I want to paint it. I'm massing things together to bigger shapes. I really notice how round that tree is there. That really does not work. Stay away from too organic looking shapes, or not organic, more too much man-made, like it's been trimmed, rounded with a hedge clipper or something. So I want more varied shape. Another one here. All these are in Sedona, Arizona, in Oak Creek Canyon. Higher elevation, a lot of water, so that's a ton of these trees. This is in the autumn. So the color is very cluttery too. Oranges, yellows, yellow greens, greens. A lot of strong dark and light. This is early in the morning. So here you have a lot of clutter, but I want to see it first. You know, if I can look at it, maybe in a thumbnail drawing or on the computer like this, kind of separate. That's the first layer in the foreground. Then maybe another layer back in here. That layer there, and then another layer back in here, there, and then there. And I can simplify it as much as I want. But I kind of look at that, and I'm going to force all those together. Oops. And there's my simplifying. My darkest darks are up front, darkest greens, real dark accents. I don't have anything back in here that's this dark. That way this comes forward, all these trees come forward. And there's no green trees this dark. That's behind that tree. All these green trees are a lighter green. This is my darkest green in the background, maybe down there. But you can see the layering really separates a lot more than the photograph. The fact that it's autumn makes it a bit more complicated, but I don't have to have all the color that's in the photograph. I want to suggest some color. So if I have a bit more green than orange or a bit more green than yellow, I can always change the color once I get that green the right value, which is what I did in here. I just used my darker green. I used a bit lighter green in here, and then the green turned to blue as it faded back. Then I started adding the equivalent of, and everything wet, adding some oranges, yellows, red oranges into the greens to kind of change it a little bit. So even if you paint it somewhat monochromatic, dark and light greens getting lighter and cooler as they go back, you can always scrub color into those greens the more you get the value right first.